Hello everyone, welcome to the Eternal Card Breakdown. My name is Pojo. A lot of stuff has happened. I have been a little away from Eternal for a couple of days. I was staying off social media because of election stuff, and as a result I didn't actually see that Bastion Rising had released. However, I did know about these balance changes, and I'd been wanting to review them, so I figured we'd talk about them while the screen is still up, and then we can get into some literal first impressions of the Bastion Rising cards. I've seen quite a few of them already, but I figured we'd just review each card in turn, like literally just take a look at them, think about them for a second, and say what we think about them. So yeah, we're going to go over all of these cards in order, and first things first, we're going to go over the balance changes, all of which are, in my opinion, pretty good. All right, so first off, we've got Turn to Seed, which is going from 3 to 4. This basically gives us the Avagraph treatment, so it is a card that is much less capable of doing basically the same things that Avagraph is doing. It is a much slower option, but it still shuts down all the cards on the board, which is something that Avagraph does not do, and, you know, still has like that sort of general advantage in that particular respect. And of course, the card is countered out by Hermit Gardener, so there's some like weaknesses there. If you were in a Throne matchup, you might have some difficulty deciding between Avagraph and Turn to Seed here, but notably, like, this is a card that still isn't affected by Aegis and still affects cards on board in addition to cards in hand, both of which make it a lot stronger. And the downside is admittedly a real downside that does come into play, but potentially one that you're not going to be quite as worried about. Avagraft also has a downside with the Valkyrie that show up when you kill it. So like, yeah, there's some interesting things going on with Turn to Seed. I think it's a fine card at 4. It was certainly obnoxious at 3, and I don't mind seeing it nerfed. It was fairly dominant removal, and yeah, this seems like a reasonable way to put it into check while still making it a very reasonable spell to be playing in blue as removal. Certainly no problems with that. Blade Moth, gone from 2 to 3, good. I really don't like this card. There's a lot of different problems with it. It's got the Corrupted keyword, which has been pretty dramatically difficult to deal with in Echoes. Echoes cards and Corrupted have been like an issue, I think, all throughout the current set. It also has the ability to make all 1 health units not very good, because it's so efficient at killing them, which makes it very, very hard to run 1 health units and means that there's just a lot less variety on the field. And finally, it punishes Tribal, which is a silly thing to be doing under the best of circumstances, and potentially just like, like not a great plan overall. Like, Tribal is fun. People like to play tribes. It really, really sucks when a card is kind of determining what your tribes are, and then like basically like making your deck weaker because you decided to play a bunch of cards that had the same text on them. Like, matching things and providing those solid synergies is something that you should be doing anyways, so this card deserves to get nerfed to 3. Honestly, this card deserves to get nerfed to even higher than that. It's just like every part of its design is really frustrating, and while it does like have a lot of interesting patterns of its own, they are all pretty griefy. I'm just not a fan of the design of this card in general, and I think that it was clearly very strong, so weakening it is clearly a good idea. Severin's gone from 6 to 7. This does reduce the amount of time, or increase the amount of time before you get your surges and your piercing griefs off with it. Means that stabilizing with Severin is a lot harder. I think this will push Severin largely out of the meta in some places, but there are certain decks that are going to have like Xenon ramps type setups, and they're not going to be too cross with losing Severin in that respect. As long as you're doing some other ramping and things like that, playing a bunch of piercing griefs is still a perfectly useful thing to have. I love Severin. I think that the card provides really fun play patterns. Obviously, like, Severin Reap is like a really ridiculous turn that can get pretty ridiculous in terms of like repeatability, I would say. Like, if you're constantly facing off against Severin, it's not nearly as much fun as the like really cool games where Severin like really extends out the length of the game while also providing you with a lot of interesting outs and a lot of like, you know, interesting board considerations. I think Severin's play pattern is super, super fun, and I think that seeing a little less of it will probably be healthier for the game in general, so I'm into this change. Battle at the Gates has gone from 4 to 3. I don't care. This card is like not a good design overall. It is interesting removal in some respects, but basically everything that it wants out of you is super situational. There's not really... It feels bad to play in almost every circumstance, and in the circumstances where you are playing it and it feels good, it is backbreaking for your opponent in a way that is just really bizarrely unfun. It can't be negated or stopped by Aegis, which is like fine, I guess. And it gives you a bunch of health, which is also potentially reasonably good. Like, this card can now be used as single target removal, which is really neat. But like, because the card is all about like that sort of value proposition of just like killing anything and then like making sure that it doesn't come back, like, I don't know. I think it'll see a lot more play as a result, but I also don't know if the card is really the premier removal that you want to be seeing. At least Void Binding things is useful, but like Echoes of Eternity has Corrupted, and I don't believe that Corrupted is stopped by Void Bound or anything like that. So like, there's just like, there's less reason to use this card, and it's just like, meh. It's whatever. Blightmouth, somebody's saying Blightmouth nerf is too much. I would say Blightmouth nerf is not enough. Like, Shadow has plenty of good tools. I don't think it's particularly important. With that being said, these balance changes are really, really interesting. So we're going to go ahead and get into those next. Or we're going to get into the new cards from the new set, which I haven't actually seen all of these. So we're going to be doing some first impressions as well as some just general card reviews. It doesn't look like I currently have access to them. That's fine. We'll get into that in just a second. Okay. So let's go ahead and show off each of the cards, and we'll get into like just sort of a full review of them. And for this, I'm going to switch to our other view. Hello, everyone. That's a distortion warp. That can go away. Okay. And so can that. Cool. All right. So first off, turn down. Deal damage to the enemy player equal to the cost of a spell they are playing at fast spell speed on 1. This is really kind of an interesting response to like the Channel the Tempest type of deck. If you're playing a big aggro list and you just want to deal like 3 damage to the opponent's face at 1, this is an acceptable way to do that. It will basically just make any like Wisdom of the Elder, Ancient Lore, anything like that, cost your opponent a bit of cause your opponent a few problems. So anytime a big scary spell is sort of the be-all end-all in the meta, then yeah, this has potentially got some really interesting value associated with it. I hadn't seen this card before. It's clearly like a fairly powerful one, I think, in terms of like, it's definitely like a detonate, but sometimes cards that just deal straight face damage like this are actually kind of good. The main disadvantage to it is, of course, that A, you aren't going to play a big spell into it if you know that it's in their hand. So if you have any way of like scrying, determining the card is in their hand, or if you just know their deck list, which is going to be probably the most common thing that happens, turn down is not going to be that effective. On the other hand, blue decks generally do need to like Channel the Tempest to survive and finish the game. And like on a turn where you turn down a Channel the Tempest, you're probably going to have a pretty good time with that. And notably, I believe this goes up before that card resolves, so they aren't going to get their draw and then get backlash or unseal or anything to follow up with. That being said, this card is very easy to play around if you know that it's there, and so that makes it very unlikely to be a meta pick or a spiky pick. I think that it does clearly provide a lot of damage for value in terms of its general cost, but like, yeah, like you'll have to be playing against the deck that is playing spells, which is not a guarantee. Spells are rarer than creatures, and big expensive spells are rarer than that, so you're not always likely to see a big spell to turn down, and you have to keep power open for it, which if you're playing in red and you're trying to deal a lot of damage to people, you're probably going to be playing really efficiently and not leaving a lot of power up each turn. Both of which make it so that this card is probably not terribly strong, even though what it provides is very, very good against specific metas and is a great way to punish control-based matchups. I think this is something that you definitely want if you are just feeling that the game is getting a little bit too slow. I think you can really do some cool things with that. As such, kind of an interesting option. Definitely a cool safety valve. All right. Erica Inferno Wing. Flying quick draw. When Erica attacks, double the strength of all your other attacking units. It is a Valkyrie, 6 cost, 6/5. The only red Valkyrie, or the only mono red Valkyrie. Of course, Ikaria is red and green. So yeah, there are a lot of interesting things about Erica in general, and Erica's attack ability is super, super strong. This is a card that you kind of want to give charge in some way, so that you can just really wail on your opponent if you can get something going with it. I think if you can manage that, then you're probably going to have a pretty good result with Erica Inferno Wing. She's very solid. She's got good evasion. She's got a good body for 6, and her attack ability is clearly very powerful with overwhelm units and aggro. She does fall into that sort of like red mid-range area where it's just a little bit hard to play cards like that, and because she doesn't have any like immediate onboard effect, that makes it a little bit trickier. On the other hand, like this is a card that you're probably going to be playing with the Simulacrum that like punishes summon effects, so there's really some potential here to like turn off a bunch of your opponent's deck, get into the mid-range, and then slam Erica Inferno Wing with charge and just roll your opponent. Lots of fun. Could very well be a cool way to win a game. I think it's probably like a B tier card overall. It doesn't seem like it has like an amazing amount of strength or an amazing amount of decks it's going to go into, but it's clearly going to see some play. Osprey Patrol. Ooh, we got a Soldier Bird. 2-cost, 2/2 flying, +1/+1 for each remaining power. You have more than the number of power cards that you've played. So it gets +1/+1 for every permanent ramp that you have, which is really interesting. I'm actually not sure if this is... I have to check the wording on this to see if this will like work with like temporary power off of like red cards, and whether or not you have to like have the power open for the Osprey Patrol to get that kind of value out. All the same, this is a 2/2 for 2 in flying, which is really not a bad stat line in time. It's got the ability to be like a 3/3 or a 4/4 or even like a 5/5 for 2. Still having flying, which is, I think, reward enough to be playing it. This card seems like an A. I would say that it's definitely going to belong in a couple of different decks. It is a strong enough like power card to just deal damage to your opponent. It provides reach in time, which is something that time does not often have access to. And while it clearly wants you to do like a lot of ramping and that kind of stuff, you only have to do a little for the card to be somewhat worth it in terms of stat line. I think that like a 3/3 flyer for 2 is pretty good, but like it is not necessarily like an insanely strong card in that respect, so I wouldn't give this like an S tier ranking or anything like that. I would say that it's definitely up there, but it's probably not like the most insanely powerful card that we've seen. Distortion Orb. We talked a lot about this one already, so I won't go over it too much. Suffice to say, Distortion Orb does make it so that you can do a lot of like interesting tricks with 1-cost cards, and also makes it so your opponent's control deck gets a lot more difficult and troublesome to deal with. Notably makes turn down cost 0, so you can play a Praxis aggro deck with Distortion Orbs, shut your opponent's control off completely, and then super punish them every time that they play a big expensive spell. That's really cool. I actually think the Distortion Orb turn down synergy is probably one of the first things we're going to be playing with in this new set. That's just like an interesting thing that has, so it's fun to add on top of that. The card clearly has problems with Face Aegis, which makes it, you know, like maybe a B or C tier card. It still belongs in some decks, and I think the value it provides is very, very good. It jumps you to 8, which is really useful. It makes it so you can play like a lot of big Praxis stuff, while also making sure that you're the first one to the big bombs, and the first one by a pretty wide margin, which is really cool. Obviously, you do need to be able to break your opponent's Aegis with that, but something like Turn Down gives you the extra synergy to do that, so control versus control matchups really seem quite interesting. Champion's Oath. Your units have Imbue. Every single unit you have can now stun another unit to gain its entire value. That's really interesting. I think that it is probably a little bit stronger than like Shard of the Spire or other like similar relics that are 3-cost and give your units a lot of like unusual abilities. Notably, imbuing is a fairly limited strong mechanic, so this in Expedition and Throne is not quite as good, but there's still a lot of things you can do with this. Like you can force stunned units to happen in Huru, which is a really good deal. You can make lots of very, very big units that can do lots of really interesting things. You can give every killer unit Imbue, which is very, very strong in Combre. I think there's plenty of strength involved in this, and if you're just playing like killer Imbue with like a bunch of Lurking Raptors or stuff like that, that could actually be a really interesting deck. That being said, 3-cost relics have generally never like ruled the landscape, so I'd say this is probably like a B tier card. It's got a clear deck that it belongs in. It's probably not going to be like green staple. Flying City Constructor. Flying Imbue. When you play a relic, play 2 Justice Citadels from your deck depleted. Flyers with Imbue are really, really strong, and this card obviously allows you to just play a bunch of Justice Sigils from your deck very, very quickly. The thing that sort of occurred to me here is obviously Vault of the Prixis. So if you want to like play 0-cost relics and get just a ton of free Justice Sigils, this is a great way to do that. Whether or not that's at all a useful thing to be doing is definitely a question for the ages. I think that overall this card is a reasonably good flying body that also gives you the ability to ramp out your game and play a bunch of stuff like Murder's Chains, other ridiculous nonsense. Notably in Throne, it will clearly belong just for the ability to A, play into Murder's Chains, and B, activate Murder's Chains. If you play a Murder's Chains, it will just immediately kill 2 units on the board. That's the end of the game. There's not really much else they can do about it. Same with like Pit of Lenecta. Like ridiculous nonsense in green-yellow. This card is clearly, like I would say, going to belong in a couple of good decks in Throne, so I'd give it like an A. I think it's like definitely quite strong, and the big giant evasive unit is nonetheless like a really powerful option. The Imbue is not so big, the stat line's still not great, but yeah, that play a relic ability actually is quite good, and it clearly provides you with some interesting late game options. So yeah, I'd say that's it's like between a B and an A. It's not amazing, but it can do some work. Metallic Razorbeak. Flying Berserk. Give one of your units Flying and Berserk. So that's the Entomb ability, of course, which means that it has to die for that to happen. Grenadin Bird is a neat tribal. I think that's pretty interesting. There are a lot of problems with this. Dies to Blight Moth really, really badly, which is kind of an issue. Grenadin are not really generally blue, so you can't do an amazing amount of cool things with that, but it is notable that it is a Grenadin and a bird. I'm kind of glad that they decided to call it a Grenadin. It does not look very Grenadin-y. Most Grenadin are much more rounded, but like, you know, it's constructed of metal and it's clearly sentient, so yeah, that's fine. In any case, the Entomb ability here is really, really good on any sort of large unit, so if you can actually trigger it with a sacrifice ability and say Felm, you can potentially get some value out of this. I think the proposition is very difficult. This one's hard to evaluate. I don't think I have a clear idea of where it belongs yet, but my suspicion is it's much stronger than it looks. Right now, I would give it like a B or a C. I just don't see how a 1/1 flyer is going to be that great on 2, and Entomb abilities are notoriously a little bit difficult to activate. It requires some work to give another unit Flying in Berserk, and at that point your opponent can just like kill it. Yeah, but obviously there are some cool things that you can do with it. Kilo decks, Suffer is suggesting, which I believe that works. I'm pretty sure that it does give the unit that you are kiloing Flying in Berserk, which could be pretty powerful. Yeah, there's some pretty interesting stuff happening there. So really, really specific things that you can do with it, and also it is a card that synergizes pretty well with any sort of like red attack buff or shadow, like, you know, like Spiteful Strike or Rapid Shot or Rampage or anything along those lines. Metallic Razorbeak has a lot of fun with it, but like none of those cards are currently like rocking the meta, so I wouldn't say that this is likely to be one of the power cards of the set. Near Perfect Imitation. Transform one of your units into a copy of a unit in your void, becomes a simulacre, put the unit from your void into your market. So this is a really interesting way to add recursion to a deck. I think that it's reasonably strong, but also like it is a 5-cost Grasping at Shadows that I think has a few more advantages than some Grasping at Shadows, but notably does not trigger summon effects and costs you one of your own units. So you have to kind of play it with like Grenadin and other sacrifice abilities. The advantages that you get in terms of recursion and being able to basically make extra copies of units that you already have, while also putting units into your market to play out for even more value, has some interesting potential. Like, for example, imagine a Shenra or a Shavka. Shavka's the red Shavka's, oh gosh, I don't remember her name, but the 2/2 that deals a damage and plays a song for you is really, really kind of interesting with Near Perfect Imitation, because this allows you to make extra copies of her while also putting more into your market, so you can Wasteland Broker them or do other things like that. Again, that doesn't seem like particularly great, but this has some potential in combo decks. As such, I think that it's got potential for like 1 or 2 decks, but it's probably not going to be a strong choice in most other ones. Fall of House Roa. We've talked about this card a little bit. This was one of the premier cards for the set. Clearly gives you a great stabilization option, so that's really neat. I think that it's kind of interesting in that it is fairly good at making just a big, old, scary board get a lot bigger and scarier. If you're playing like Stone Scar Gunslingers and your opponent is trading with you, this will just end the game. So it's an amazing card to fetch out of a market or like grab with other types of setups just so you can do like some really interesting ridiculous turns that have deadly lifesteal and that giant +2/+2 bonus. It is not a fast spell, so it's not a combat trick. It is strictly used for stabilizing, and most of those cards do not belong in like an extremely strong spot. Vicious Rejuvenation, that kind of thing. Like, these are not cards that you play too often, but this is still like a red-purple card that you would play in something like, for example, a Reactor Forge deck, and you can get some real value out of it there. I think that it's got a lot of potential. I would definitely give it like a B. I think it's on the up and up. Zumik Shaman. When an enemy unit gets negative strength, your units get +2 strength. 4/5. This looks decent. 5 is an unusual cost. There are not a lot of 5-cost shadow cards that I can think of that are extremely efficacious. A lot of shadows, like major drops, are at 4, and then they're trying to get to Ikaria at 6. So this doesn't fit super well into like the current like mono shadow lists, but I think there are a lot of ways to give things negative strength that are fairly easy to do, and providing a permanent rally effect is definitely not a bad deal. I think this compares disfavorably to, of course, Champion of Cunning, the card that does this by itself at the end of your turn, but you can still trigger it multiple times in a row, which on flyers, lifesteal units, unblockable units, all of the things that Shadow is known for, potentially has a lot of strength. I would give this a tentative like A to B in Expedition. In Throne, I don't think it's powerful enough. I think there's already too many things in this particular slot that Shadow can already deal with. So, like, but it's got some ideas associated with it. I would say that it's just like a little underwhelming in execution, at the very least in Throne. Okessa, we've talked about this card before. It's ridiculous. I think this card's probably like first on the chopping block for nerfs as far as things go. It has a really nice little upside of treasure troves. The exhaust ability allows you to play a big, scary relic from your hand for very cheap. And those two things together, combined with a reasonable body on an explorer in Praxis, I think just means that you have like an immediate deck that's going to be very powerful to play with. This thing combos super well with a bunch of different stuff. It's not too hard to get the 2 units down. I think that basically like this is going to be a premier deck, and that something is going to be about like playing around this sort of big, ridiculous nonsense, particularly in Throne where you have access to so many different expensive and scary relics. Okessa's ability is just really, really good, and the treasure trove bonus for destroying relics is also really nice. I think that both of those things synergize really well with each other, and the body's not bad either. Like, everything it does is just good, so seems like a really, really strong card. Glaive of the Chosen. Ooh, Rakano Weapon. I haven't seen this one yet. Gives Endurance, which is notably an extremely strong option. Surge, Glaive of the Chosen, and units in your market give +1 strength. Hello, gamer handle here. Okessa is very scary, I agree. Okay, so yeah. A lot of things going for this weapon. One, it's an endurance weapon at 3, which I don't think there is one of those in Rakano at the moment. Rakano notably has to use like Stalwart Shield or Deep Forge Plate, both of which are more expensive options to get rid of permafrosts, other forms of stun. The cheaper the effect is, the better off you are with it, and a 1/1 is a meaningfully small amount, but you do get to Warcry this, and like the card has the Surge ability, which is going to be probably fairly immediately efficacious. You're probably going to play this on 4, but you're going to get like an extra bit of bonus with it. Then you go in with a Finest Hour, and you feel pretty good about it. Units in your market getting +1 strength means that most likely the Ikaria in your market gets +1 strength, and that means that you can just like run over your opponent with an Ikaria late in the game, which is kind of a nice little deal. I think it might be wrong to put a bunch of units in your market when you have Glaive of the Chosen, but I think the card has enough strength as a weapon option to be played in several different Rakano decks in Expedition, and potentially even Throne. Yeah, tentative A, close-ish to B in Expedition. In Throne, I would not be certain that this is going to see play just because it is a fairly run-of-the-mill weapon, but that endurance is definitely a big deal, and depending on how popular Permafrost is in that format, it's got some potential. Okay, what's next? Sling of the Chi. Ooh, that's a good name. Enemies can't transform your cards. When you play a unit with 6 strength or more, it deals 6 damage to an enemy unit. At the end of your turn, if you have a unit with 6 health or more, you draw a card. So it's a Skycrag card, which is notably not a big unit format, but it makes it so that every big unit that you play is A, capable of knocking your opponent's units to the ground, which is super good, and also B, that you're going to get extra card draw just for having a unit that stays on board for more than one turn. That's a unit with 6 health or more, which, I mean, if you're playing a unit with 6 health or more, it's fairly likely to stick for the turn. So you're likely to get that card replaced, and once you get into that, like, you are definitely in a place where you can do some really wild stuff. I think that this card is wildly out of color for what it wants to be doing, but that doesn't really matter because you're just playing like Ixtun or like red, blue, yellow. Is that Ixtun? I thought that was Ixtun. I might be wrong about that. But yeah, you're going to be playing red, blue, yellow and just like throwing out 6/6s, and each one of those 6/6s is going to smash up one of your opponent's unit and then draw a card. Oh, that's really fun. This card seems very powerful. I would give it an A. Tentatively, like, I would say it is one of the stronger cards in the set. Certainly, other people in chat are currently convinced that it is by far the best card in the set. I think it's a very solid choice for that, but notably, like, relics still do cost you something in tempo, and you aren't getting that tempo back until you play a unit that with 6 strength or more. Obvious target for this for me, Lurking Raptors. Ooh, delicious. Really, really fun stuff. Yeah, I think you can definitely do some wild stuff with Sling of the Chi, and blue has a lot of face sieges available, so you're capable of protecting this relic while also allowing for all your big, stupid nonsense to do big, stupid nonsense. This is a great card. It's really well designed. It's a lot of fun, and it's potentially too powerful. I guess we'll find out. De Angelo Arson. Yeah, I talked about this one a bit already, but it's a Flame Blast at 9, which is a decent time for a Flame Blast, and it's better than a Flame Blast above 9, which is really, really fun. It also forces your opponent to discard 2 cards, which means it's just straight value in the form of card discard. I think that, like, playing this on 3 is fairly satisfying, and playing this on like 6 when your opponent has 2 cards left is extremely satisfying, and like just overall, like, this card provides you with a lot of useful things that will really punish a lot of players for a lot of different reasons. Seems really good. Obviously does have the ability to whiff on an Aegis, but overall this is a really, really strong option and should be very, very fun to play. Brody Bastion's Hope. We've talked about this one already, but Minotaurs, synergy, delightful fun, and the card is decent on its own. So yeah, this card's definitely an A class, like super, super good, and plays well in a lot of different decks. Could be even like S tier good. I think it's just super, super solid. Fertile Soil. Play 3 Little Seeds. When you transform one or more of your cards while Fertile Soil is in your hand, you reduce the cost of this card by 1. So anytime you transform, you get a cheaper way to play some seeds. On the other hand, this card at 0 is still not great. It's kind of a neat synergy with like other little seeds. So if you're playing with like Turn to Seed, or if you're playing with your harvesters and you're just trying to like make a seed deck, then this is kind of an interesting synergy. But overall, I don't think this card has a lot of play to it. It would be nice if you could make multiple copies of it. And if that were the case, then you could start growing your own little garden, and that would get pretty outrageous pretty quickly. But currently, I don't think that this card is extremely strong. Send an Agent. Kill an enemy unit or relic with 1 faction or less. It is an Annihilate that is also good in time, that also requires time, but has the advantage of A, being able to kill relics, and B, being able to kill colorless cards. That means it's just more flexible than an Annihilate, so this is clearly just like going to belong in every Zenith deck. I don't know if like that merits it like being an S, but I think it's like a fast spell that is just in every time and shadow deck, period. So yeah, I mean, this card is defining for the archetype. It's incredibly strong for Xenon, and every Xenon deck is going to want to play 4 copies. So yeah, into it. Super, super strong. This might be, of the 3 that we have said that are the strongest, this one's going to see the most play. Marcos Stormhall. When one of your units attacks, play a +2/+2 weapon on Marcos. When an enemy unit attacks, draw a card. Okay, so this gives you a big ol' friend every time you attack, which is whatever, that's okay. I mean, an 8/8 is no different from like a 6/6 in most respects. I mean, 8/8, I think, after you get the attack, is probably the stickiest that you're going to get. It's immune to Obliterate, it's immune to most forms of removal, you can't Ice Bolt it. All of that stuff happens, and you can, I believe, trigger that before anything else happens. So that's pretty neat. But when an enemy unit attacks, draw a card is definitely an interesting way to stabilize. If this card had Aegis, it would be horrendously bonkers. As it stands, it doesn't have an onboard impact, and it can be removed before attacks, and if your opponent decides not to attack, I don't know that Marco Stormhold is going to win the game for you, so I would probably rank this like a solid C. Just doesn't seem great for a Huru finisher. Wouldn't mind this card at 6. Know thy enemy. Kill each unit with cost 2 or less in Argenport. Amplify 2. Play a unit with cost 5 or less from the top 5 cards of your deck, and then bottom the rest. So you get to do this as many times as you like, which can play potentially a lot of scary units very, very quickly. But notably, if you're amplifying, that means that you're ramping, and the units with cost 5 or less are potentially not things you're going to want to ramp for. Still, this triggers a bunch of summon abilities, and it's something that you can use to punish aggro. I think that this is probably like an A card. It's something that you could definitely play in most Argenport decks and feel pretty happy about, and it plays a lot of scary things in Shadow and in Justice. Like, just imagine Mono Shadow with Know Thy Enemy. You have access to like Impending Doom, Aramot, Blight Moth. Basically, you have all of these different units that you're already super willing to play. You amplify this card for as much as you want, you kill everything on the board that's aggro, and then you just throw out a bunch of your scary units that are really hard to deal with. Okay, seems amazing. Uxu Carnivorous Bloom. This card is the huge finisher in Feln. I think it definitely belongs in a variety of different Feln decks. Obviously, you want to be supporting it a little bit with synergy, but it seems like a solid finisher in Expedition. In Throne, it's going to be a little harder for this card to like basically take priority over other Feln finishers, which tend to be a little slower but a little bit more reliable. I think in Expedition, this card is really, really strong. So yeah, seems really, really solid on that front. Beacon! Card Advantage Engine, extremely fun design, the fun relic of this set. Probably not amazingly strong, but certainly something that I'm going to want to play with a lot. I would say this is like a solid B, and we're going to have a ton of fun with it. Grand Suppressor, this card's really, really good, and is probably up there in like a wide variety of decks. I would say it's like an A tier card. I don't know if it's like super broken or overpowered, but I would rather see it as a 2/2, so potentially I could give it like an S. I think it's just like gonna be everywhere. We'll see to what extent it's played. Other people have had a day with this set already, and I'm not really sure if people are playing Grand Suppressor or not, but it certainly looks like an annoying prison card that also happens to be a playable card in most formats. I'm very glad that there currently is a way to kill it called Send an Agent, because that's going to mean a lot for Xenon decks that want to do summons, and like, yeah, it seems like there are a couple of different tools to kill Grand Suppressor in this current campaign, which I think lowers my estimation of it a little bit overall. But yeah, it seems solid. Pumpworks Monstrosity, this card is not good at all, but it's fun. Yeah, I think this is the worst card in the set. It's a delightfully weird, colorless monster that cares about how many cards you have in your deck, and the Entomb ability is not great. So, yeah, there's no real reason to play this except if you want to play a 150-card deck, and if you want to play a 150-card deck, this is the card for you, more power to you. It's actually not going to make your 150-card deck all that much stronger, because it's going to be a 5/5 or a 15/15 for 5 that is probably going to be like a 13/13 by the time you find it, and the rest of your deck is going to suck enough that this may not be all that good. Still, I think 150 card decks should have some support, and so I'm perfectly happy to see this one. Fine design overall, but yeah, this is like the only D, I think, in the list. It is just not playable in anything. So all the same, very interesting option, so lots of good stuff. All right, that's our first impression of Bastion Rising cards, as well as our complete review of all of the balance changes. So we'll put this up on YouTube and everyone can see it. Thank you to the YouTube folks so much for watching. As always, I am on YouTube, Patreon, Twitch, and Twitter, all under Loco Pojo. So if you want to see when we're streaming, what like videos we have up, that kind of stuff, follow us on Twitter. And if you want to support, you can come to Patreon. Other than that, we are going to be playing with these cards now, so we'll see you very soon. Thank you so much for watching. Cheers.